Hello, my name is Nick, and in this video I will be showing you basic navigation, how to make parts and assemblies in Inventor. This is just going to be a basic overview. There's a lot more things you could do with these tools that I'm about to show you, but this will give you what you need to make the DPD bots in the later videos of this series. So first thing is project files. Inventor needs to know where your files are located, so what we do is we define what's called a workspace. To do this, you go to the projects folder up here, and what we're going to do is create a new project called, let's call it testbot, and we're going to point it to our testbot folder. And that's all you need to do, and unfortunately I already made it, so this will not show up for you guys. Now because I made it already, I have to go browse for it, and you will do this every time that you get files from your partners. They'll give you a folder of just files and a project file. And what you have to do, the first thing you have to do is you have to open up that project file. So I'm going to browse to where I have my project file and my project folder. Okay, and I'm going to open that up, and here we go. Now, anytime I open parts, it'll go right to this folder. Okay, I can access all of these parts. Anytime I create a new part and I save it, it's going to save it to that folder. So now we're ready to go into actual part creation. And again, first thing you have to do is select this project file before you open any of your parts down below. Otherwise, you're going to have problems. You're going to have to redo things, and vendors are going to yell at you. It's not fun. Let's create a new part. There's a few ways to do this. You could do this with this little view here by just clicking the part button. You could go up here and click new and part, or you could go just to file, new, part. And I prefer that last method because it's the easiest. And I get the style conflict, but you guys won't. So that's how you create a new part. And so what we're going to do is go over the views. So I'm going to open up a part here, and we're going to go over basic navigation. So now that it's open, you can hold down your scroll wheel and move around, and you're able to pan. You can hold shift and hold down your scroll wheel and move around, and you're able to kind of rotate around. And you can zoom out and you can zoom in. If you right click on something, a whole bunch of options will show up. Okay, this will be useful in the future. So the basic parts of the view here, the window, is the feature tree on the side. This is going to show you everything that you've been doing, and if you've been working on sketches, the sketches will show up here, and this is how you edit things and all of that. Up top here we have our feature tree. So once you make a sketch, you can make features out of it. So for example, this extrusion here, oops, let me find it. This extrusion here, it's from this basic sketch here, the blue highlighted thing there. And so all this did was took this sketch, okay? This was just made with lines and dimensions and constraints. Took that sketch, and what it's doing is just extruding it out. And I could even edit the length of the extrusion here, but I'm gonna go to here only. So this is the view you'll see when you're 3D modeling, but when you're in a sketch, for example, I want to create a sketch based off of this face here. Let's do that. It'll pull up the sketch tab, and here you got a whole new ribbon up top. And so for sketches, what you can do is you can make a collection of lines, okay? They can be angled lines, it can be any kind of lines you want. Just a note here that if you're clicking onto a point, you have to make sure that the dot, you see on my cursor how it's green, that means you're clicking the point. If it's yellow, like here, that means you're not clicking the point. And if you click it and you zoom in, it's not actually on that point. That's just a note. So let's recreate that line. Heck, let's make it an arc. Okay, this is how you make an arc. You click the two endpoints, and you click how big you want the radius to be. You can create circles in sketches. You can create rectangles in sketches. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do that I'm not going over. If you click these arrows down here, there's a lot of other options. And once you have your basic geometries laid out, what you want to do is then dimension and constrain it. So if I wanted to make this a 1/2 inch hole, 0.5, I just have to type in 0.5 and it'll show up. Notice how my default dimensions are in inches. What you can do if you want to use like millimeters, for example, you just have to type mm or km or whatever your unit is. So from there, we can create dimensions for like this arc. I'm going to create a radius dimension here of 0.5, sure. You can define the length of lines. You can go from point to point and do it that way, or point to line segment, and you could do it that way. That's how you create dimensions. If you want to see how this line is slightly angled? You can't really tell, but it is slightly angled. If I go here, I can do, and go to the down, I could do a horizontal dimension, or if I go to the side, I can specify the rise over the run, okay, the vertical dimension. If I want to do a dimension along the line itself, I can right click on it, okay, after I selected the line. So here, let me start that over. I got a dimension here. Let's click the line. Let's right click it, and here's the options for the type of dimensions we can do. We already saw vertical and horizontal, so let's do an aligned dimension. And it doesn't look that different from a horizontal, but what it is it's along the line rather than vertical or horizontal, okay? So those are the different types of dimensions that you will be working with. The other things you'll be working with are things called constraints, and there's what, 12 of them here. And if you hover over them long enough, you can see exactly what they're used for. So I'm not going to go over these. Just know that that this is here, and if you ever want any help, all you have to do is hover over it. Inventor is really good at giving you help for things. Like if you hover over anything, it'll tell you what it is and how to use it. Okay. So I'm going to go over another thing called uh, construction lines. So say I don't want this to be an actual solid piece. I just want it to be something that I reference dimensions off of. So I can make these lines construction lines. And if I were to extrude this now, okay, notice how it didn't, it saw this solid line as a border, but it didn't see these construction lines. Like I can't select it, right? I could select this. I could deselect this by holding control. I could deselect this by holding control, but I cannot select the construction lines. That's what they're there for. They're just for reference. So with those construction lines, I can then dimension based off of those, okay? Or I can do constraints based off of those. They're really useful. I'll get into them and more advanced concepts as we build the robot. But no, those are a thing, and to change between them, all you have to do is click this button up here. Or say you're creating a new line and you don't want it to be a solid line, well, you can hit the construction line there and it'll create construction lines. Okay. So let's go ahead and fully constrain this little arc here into what I'm just gonna go freehand at it. I'm just gonna put a few constraints in here to just make it look more uniform. And if you ever have conflicting constraints, uh, you have this arc constraint here, this radius constraint here, but you're trying to redefine it as something different, it'll give you this little error here, and you could either not put that constraint, or you can find the constraint that's creating the error, delete it, and redo your constraint. See how it works now? Okay. So let's do a few more constraints. And another thing with Inventor that's pretty useful is these midpoints. So this line here, if you go hover over roughly the center, there's this green point that will show up. That's the midpoint of it. It's for any single line, any line that you have in Inventor, it'll show a midpoint for it, right? And you can do your dimensions or constraints based off of midpoints, like I just did there. And so another thing that I'm going to talk about now is project geometry. Okay, so if I wanted to reference this line here, it's not actually in my sketch yet, right? I can't reference it yet. What I have to do is I have to project it into my sketch. See how now it's projected into my sketch, and I can actually do constraints and dimensions based off of that geometry. Okay, that's pretty useful when you're trying to line things up, but you don't want to have to add a million dimensions. All you want to do is just say line this up with that. So like if I were to make a plate, on top of here, and I wanted to line the two holes up, I could do a bunch of math and dimensions, or I could just lay it on top and edit the part and make a hole based on the projected geometry that this circle would be. Okay, so notice how our lines turned blue now? That means that we can't move them at all. And what I created here is just completely arbitrary. There's no reason for it. It's just to show you kind of the tools that you can use. So you can then select the profile, and you could cut away material. So if I select all, it'll cut through the base there, okay? Or I could edit the extrusion. I could make it create material instead of cutting away. There's a few options that you could do. So you could go through everything, or you could go a certain distance, like a 1/4 inch, or you could go to a face. So like if I wanted to go to this bottom face, like it'll only extrude it to the bottom face and no more, no less, right? There's certain things you can do, and you can play around with this, right? You'll see me use them as I build the robot. Okay, so that's how you create parts. That's how you kind of create sketches and extrusions. There's other features that you can use. So say I didn't make that an extrusion. I don't want to consume the sketch. I want to leave the sketch there. I can revolve this sketch around an axis, right? Say I want to revolve it around that axis, and it'll make it a kind of a circular part there. I could do that. If I wanted to put a hole in it, I could select a point on the so I'm trying to find a point. I could select a point on the model, right? Like, I don't know, right there. I wanted to put a hole there that kind of cuts through everything. I could do that, and I could specify it as a simple hole or a threaded hole. A simple hole for now will do. And I want it to protrude an 1/8 inch, and I want it to cut away a diameter of a 1/4 inch, right, on those 2 points. You could do holes, or you could do something called a fillet, which is just a rounded corner. So if you select an edge and you have a radius for your fillet, you select the edge and it'll round it out pretty nicely for you. That's pretty useful. Those are really the only tools, the only features that you're going to be using in the robot that I'm going to show you. Extrude, revolve, hole, and fillet. Everything else you can use, but it's slightly more complicated, and you'll kind of figure it out over time. All right, so now let's work with assemblies. So you can create a new assembly. This style conflict won't show up for you again. And when everything loads, it'll be blank. And what you can do is place components down, right? You can't create components in here very easily, but you can place components, place parts that you already created down. So I have this base plate, I can place that down, right? And right now, it's able to move around. But the problem is that if everything in your model is able to move around, then things are going to jump on you. Things aren't going to stay stationary. So what you need is at least one component that is stationary that everything else is referenced to that won't move, right? So it'll always stay in this location, right? So let's go ahead and place other components. Let's put the top plate on here. Okay. So I've got 2 parts. And by the way, I'm going to mention the View tab now. So notice how these parts are kind of hard to discern, right? Where the edges are and all of that. Well, if you go to View, you can change your visual style. And I prefer shaded with edges because I can see how it highlights or outlines everything, shows you exactly where the edges and the points are. I find that very useful and beneficial. So let's go ahead and assemble things, right? So this is just moving around. This is fixed, but this is floating and able to move around. Let's make this flush or mated to this piece here. So we're going to click the constraint command here. And there's, again, different types of constraints that you can do. You can play around with these and figure it out. I'm going to use mating constraints, flush constraints. So mating constraints is to say I want this face to touch that face. It's going to flip it over and it's going to mate them together. And if I wanted a flush constraint, I say I wanted this face flushed with this face. See how they're nice and flush together? Okay. Or you could do an angle constraint. Say I wanted these to be 25 degrees offset from each other. I could do that. So let's just constrain this. So I want this face to mate with this face. Okay. I want this edge to be mated with this edge. Let's apply that. And I want, well, let's move this a little bit so we see better. I want this edge to mate with this edge. Okay, so now this doesn't move at all. Now it's fully constrained. That's perfect. So that's how you edit assemblies in Inventor. And so what I'm going to show you next is how to uh, kind of edit parts that are referenced to other parts. So say if you remove the visibility of this part, say I wanted a hole through the top plate that matches this hole here, right? If I put the top plate back on, there's no hole here. I could do a bunch of math and sketches and geometries and open up this part and do that and add that, but I'd prefer an easier way, so I can just double click this. See how everything else is grayed out, but you're editing this part. This ribbon comes up again where you're editing the part itself. And so now what we can do is we can create a sketch on this top plate, and we can reference and project geometry of the hole that I want it to line up with. So I can just project this geometry here, and I don't care about these lines here, so I'm just going to make these construction lines. This is a solid line, and we're going to go ahead and finish the sketch. Extrude that circle. We're going to cut through everything, and now we have a hole that's lined up perfectly with that stack. So if we save the part and return back, you can see that hole is lined up with the hole below it, right? But the problem is that things are now adaptive, and that is really hard to work with, and I recommend just every single time removing that adaptivity. So right click on this part, remove the adaptivity, and now things are just going to be easier, right? So it's adaptive means that if this part moves, the hole will stay in the same location. So if this part moves an inch this way, the hole will move, will stay in the same location. So it'll actually be an inch this way on the top plate since it came towards us an inch. That's usually bad. So we're going to remove that adaptivity and things are fixed. It just makes it really easier, really easy. Okay. Okay. So those are all the basic parts or tools that you need to make the robot. Hopefully you understood all of that. I will be going over it more in depth as I create the robot, but if you are still confused on things, I would recommend going back and just playing around with it and getting acclimated with it.